So I will welcome you now to our November 2022 virtual quality talk, which is actually taking place in December, but that's cool. We still managed to fit it in here before the end of the year. And yes, this is our last one of these series for 2022. We'll start with a couple of thank yous. So for the last time, I guess, this is your 2022 KWSQA board. And we'll also thank D2L, one of our local tech companies here, who continues to support us by allowing us to use their Zoom account for these virtual events. I would also like to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. So the head office for our organization is located on the Haldeman Tract. This is land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee people of the Six Nations of the Grand River. It's also within the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. And as always, we just want to express that we feel privileged to be able to live and work and build this software quality community in such a great region. Another important reminder is about our code of conduct. You can see sort of a brief summary of it here. The full version you can find on our website. And please do reach out if you ever have questions about this or need to report any kind of incident. We do take this seriously, and it applies to both our virtual and in-person events. So here are all the usual ways that you can engage with our organization outside of coming here today. So there are a few options that you can find on our website, such as signing up for our mailing list, or if your company is interested in co-hosting a testing games event with us. We are also taking proposals for presentations at this series at any time. So if you have a talk or presentation you'd like to share during a meeting like this, feel free to visit our website and fill out the form. I've got purchase a membership crossed out right now because we're just sort of coming to the end of the year here, and the all the stuff that you would want from your membership has just happened, like the ability to vote in the election and that kind of thing. So we'll put new membership purchases on hold until the new year when everything resets. But at that time, you can visit our website and get your 2023 membership. So speaking of 2023, just a little bit of a preview of what's coming. We do have our January and March talks all planned out already. We're still finalizing exactly who will present in February, but we'll keep you posted as we learn more. And so, as you know, if you've been to these before, we have an opportunity for you to participate in a draw to win a $50 Amazon gift card. And this is our way of hoping to motivate you to give us your feedback about these meetings. We really do value your input and love to hear from the attendees. I will say that for today in particular, if you want to get in on this draw, the draw is happening tonight at our annual general meeting. And so I'm going to have to do the draw within the next few hours before that meeting starts. And so if you want one more entry, it's not too late, but sort of try to do it right away after the meeting if possible. If I end up doing the draw before you submit your feedback, then it will count towards next year, but next year is far away. So it would be better if you could get entered for tonight. And yeah, speaking of the AGM, it is tonight, and our election did take place last week. So if you were a voting member, you would have been given the opportunity to participate in that. So I won't announce the results officially here because the AGM is the place where we will share that publicly for the first time. But stay tuned for, we'll share the information through other channels shortly afterwards. And of course, if you are a member, you are more than welcome to join the AGM tonight. Starts at 7:30. It's on Zoom. Yeah, and I think that's it for announcements and things. I will turn it over to our presenter at this point. So Ian is joining us from Colorado today, so it's nice. This is another time where we've been able to take advantage of the virtual format to bring you a speaker from a little further away. Although Ian does have connections to our area, he's got some immediate family members living in Kitchener-Waterloo area. And so perhaps in the future, we may see him in person at a Targeting Quality conference or something. But anyway, I'll turn it over to Ian for the rest of the time here. And Ian, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Tina. Hey, everybody. So I'm Ian. I'm actually originally from Canada. I grew up in the Northwest Territories and lived around Kingston, Ontario for high school and college, moved up to Ottawa, kind of started my career as a software developer and doing firmware development. Then I moved down to the States in 2000. I've been down here since. But yeah, thanks for having me today. I'm going to share my screen here. And this is meant to be kind of a bit of an interactive Q&A sort of workshop as well. So if you've got questions as we go, you're welcome to ask in chat. I've also been a software teacher, so I'm used to watching the participant panel in Zoom. So you're welcome to like raise a hand or just unmute. If you've got questions as we go, feel free to just unmute and say, hey, I got a quick question. I'm happy to take questions as we go. So, so yeah. So I'm a senior developer advocate at Postman. I've been at the company now about a year. I've been using Postman for many years, and if you're familiar with using it as a testing tool, I'm going to show you kind of a new way of using Postman a little bit as part of a way to sort of speed up your productivity a little bit if you work on full stack teams or cross-functional teams. So we'll go through some of those notes today. So being a primarily backend developer myself, I'm more likely to be a blocker for someone else's work if I'm building out an API where like a front-end developer can't do any of their work until they wait for my API to be finished. Or if I'm more of a middleware developer and I've got to call a backend service, I've got to wait for that to be finished. And so one of the kind of the impetus for this talk and this workshop is, we can have all the testing and all the documentation and everything ready to go. But sometimes it can be difficult and a little bit tricky to actually go build out software if like a backend API or a service that we're relying on isn't finished yet. And so what I'm going to walk through today is how can we sort of speed up this process a little bit, so that we don't have to like make guesses and say, well, this is what we think we want this thing to be, or we've kind of documented what we want our API contract to be, but we're not exactly sure. This will give us a little bit more flexibility around what we can build here. So what I'm going to walk you through is a bit of a demonstration on how to use servers within Postman. So if you don't even have an API yet, how can we utilize Postman to spin up a quick mock server to sort of mimic what we want to have happen? We're going to focus on RESTful APIs and GraphQL today. If anyone's familiar with GraphQL, we're going to go through a little bit of that as well. I think a lot of us are going to be familiar with using RESTful APIs, and so we'll spend a little bit of time on that. And I'll be demonstrating this kind of step by step as we go. Definitely ask questions as I work. As Tina mentioned, this will be recorded, so you can always come back and you can kind of hit pause if I go a little bit quickly. And the next couple of slides will have some URLs and so on that you can write down. Might be a little bit faster to take a screenshot of this next screen. And so we've got some stuff on this slide. So if you're going to follow along, you will need to be logged into your Postman account if you use Postman. So you can go directly into the web application, or you can use the desktop application. I'll be using the web app myself today. And we're going to create a new workspace to do our work. And then we need to sort of clone this into our workspace. So very similar, if you're familiar with using Git, it would be a very familiar sort of process where we're going to make a fork of this mock server starter kit, and we're going to fork that into a workspace and then develop off of it from there. And then we're basically going to use an existing working server for both a RESTful API as well as GraphQL. And we're going to save those responses. Then we're going to use that to build a mock server. And so if you're waiting for an actual RESTful API, or you're waiting for your team to build out a GraphQL API, we can actually go hit a real server, save some responses, and then we can change those responses for what we think our API contract is going to be. And then you can use that as your mock server. And then finally from there, we'll kind of look at some other stuff that Postman is going to do as part of spinning this up. So you can use the link, the go.postman.io, or I'll drop this in the Zoom chat as well. This is kind of the long form URL for what we're going to be looking through today. And that should take you over to this screen here. If you actually just open up, actually let me move that over here a little bit. You can use the search bar at the top here as well, and we can just search for mock server starter kit. And what we want to look for in here is we want to look for something that was actually made by the Postman DevRel team. I'm just going to shrink this down a little bit here just so we can see a little bit more what we're looking for. So mock server starter kit, you want to make sure that you're looking for a collection. So you're going to look for the folder icon. You want to make sure that you choose the one from the Postman DevRel team. There have been lots of forks of this collection. I've given this workshop before, and so you may find a bunch of other forks of this. You want to make sure that you fork over the one from Postman DevRel. So make sure that if you're searching in Postman for this, that you actually choose the one from our DevRel team, and that should take you over to what we're seeing on the screen right now. Let me know if the font size is okay. If you want, I can zoom in a tiny bit more as I work here. But this is where we're going to get started. So this is a mock server starter kit. We've got a collection in here. We have a couple of folders with some other endpoints as we go. But the first thing we need to do is we need to make a copy of this into a fresh workspace that we have edit control over. When you search for this within Postman, this is going to be a read-only copy. And so you're not actually going to be able to interact and do anything with this. So the first thing we need to do is go make a workspace. So at the top of the interface, I'm going to click on Workspaces. And I'm going to click on the button that says Create Workspace. And I'm going to call this one KWSQA just for today. And as far as the visibility goes, you can really use any of these if you'd like. If you do decide to make it public, just be aware that you probably shouldn't store API keys in here if you're actually working with a real API later on. If you do things in a public view, some of your information may be viewable to other people that happen to find it as a search result. And so you may want to keep it as a personal level, or if you're on a team, you can do a team level workspace. I'm going to leave mine as team for now. And then I've got to go back to that link. So I've got to go back to what we were looking at earlier. So I'm just going to click on the link that I had in the Zoom chat and take us back over to here. And what I'm going to do from here, now that I have that workspace created, when I come back into this, the link that I put in Zoom, when I hover over this, I can see the 3 dots over here on the right side. And if we click on this and scroll down a tiny bit, there's going to be an option to create a fork. And this is very much like using Git, where you're sort of branching off that work, and it's going to remember a reference back to this. And so if if my team ever goes in and we make an update to this, you'll actually see a little notification in this notification bell in the very top right corner of the interface. You'll see a little notification saying, hey, the mock server starter kit got updated, and you can actually merge any changes we make down into your copy if you like. So it works very much like a code revision system. So I'm going to go ahead and say click create a fork. Let's try that again. Oh, there it goes. And we need to give it a label. I'm just going to give it my name for now. And then we have to tell it which workspace that we're going to put this into. And so this is why we have to make that workspace to begin with. And so I'm just going to choose the new workspace that I just created. And again, if you select this checkbox, then you'll get notified of any changes. If you don't want those notifications, you can turn that off. You don't have to have that checkbox enabled. So I created that fork, and it immediately takes me over to my new workspace. And if I expand this, then I'll see the RESTful endpoints and we'll see the GraphQL endpoint. And I've also got a lot of documentation written in here as well that you can follow through. So at a very top level, if you look at the documentation, and if it does close up, you can look at the right context bar over here, and it'll be the icon at the very top, and that'll open up the documentation again. At the high level, it'll give you very generic kind of, this is kind of where we're going. This is really high level sort of steps. If you click on the folders, for example, the RESTful endpoint, and you look at the documentation, this is going to be more specific instructions for just doing the RESTful endpoint. So if you click on the GraphQL endpoints, then you'll get more specific information about this is GraphQL specifically. So there's lots of documentation in here that you can follow, and I'll basically be walking through some of the stuff step by step as we go. So the first thing we needed to do is build out that workspace and fork our collection into that workspace. The next thing we need to do is set up an environment. So if you're used to using like virtual environments or .env type of files, it's going to feel very similar to this. And what this is going to give us the flexibility to do within Postman is to kind of set up this mock environment that we want to use today. But then you can also reuse these variables that we're going to put in our environment for later on. If you want to go into a production mode, then you can just copy these variable names that we're going to use today and actually point to like a real server. And then within Postman, you can just toggle between those environments, and you'll either hit your development environment or your mock environment, or you can hit like an actual production environment as well.
Wi-Fi password.
So is there a question there? Nope. Okay. All right, so let's keep going. So the first thing we need to do is set up an environment here. So I'm going to click on the environments icon on the left context bar, and we're going to go create a brand new environment here. And I'm just going to call this, I'll call this development. Oops, spell it correctly. And now we're going to add two variables. If you're going to work in RESTful APIs, we're going to make a variable in here called echo URL. And these will be case sensitive. And so the word echo is lowercase and URL is going to be uppercase. And I'm going to make another one called Spotify URL. The GraphQL endpoint that we have is going to use the Spotify API today. And all that's set up. You don't have to worry about setting up Spotify. That's all set, all ready to go. Now, when we talk about environments, when I mentioned earlier, having a public workspace can sometimes expose your API keys. And so when you're building out an environment like this, if I had like a secret, API key, you probably don't want to set it as an initial value. There is a type that you can set in here to be secret, but anything that I type in here will automatically be masked as I type it. But because it's in a public workspace, anything you set in initial value actually gets synchronized to the Postman cloud. And if somebody happens to find your public workspace, your environment is part of that public workspace. Therefore, your environment is also public. And people can come in and they can actually click on that eyeball icon and actually see what it is you typed in here. So just keep that in mind. You probably don't want to set things in initial value. We can just set current value on these things. So if you are setting an API key, please don't set it in initial value. Only use the current value. The current value field will not synchronize with the Postman cloud. And so it'll only save within your local environment. We're not going to need this one today. I just wanted to demonstrate that really quick. So in this case, these URLs are going to be public. They're part of the documentation. So I'm going to set this as both initial value and current value. So our echo URL, and this is all in the documentation, this one is going to be postman-echo.com. Excuse me. Actually, just getting over COVID myself, so I'm still a little congested. Apologize for clearing my throat and coughing. But the echo URL, we're just going to set to postman-echo.com. And as soon as I click into the current value field, the application will automatically copy that value over for us. And then the Spotify URL, this one's a little bit longer, but this one's going to be postman-spotify-graphql.herokuapp.com. And I'm just going to paste this in the Zoom chat as well. So you don't have to type that in, but this is also in the documentation as well. Now, anytime you make an alteration in Postman, if you notice the tab in here has an orange dot, if you can discern the color orange. So that tells us we have things that we need to save. So make sure that you click on that save icon. If you're on a Mac, Command S will save. If you're on a Windows or Linux PC, Control S will automatically save that for you as well. Or you can click on the icon. So that was the first thing that we needed to do. So we made our workspace. Now we've made our environment. Now we can actually go call these endpoints. So I'm going to go back to my collections. And now if I go to my GET request over here, we notice in the URL right here, if you can discern the color red, if we hover over our echo URL, it says it's an unresolved variable. And that's because we haven't chosen the new environment that we just made. So up in the top right corner of our interface where it says no environment, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick that new development environment that we just made. And if you notice the highlighting went from red to orange on the echo URL. Now the double curly braces, it comes from handlebars. Basically, it's just a way of creating variables within Postman. And so now when I hover over it, we can see that the scope of this value came from our environment. And we actually see that it resolves to postman-echo.com. And now if I send this request over, this is how most people are used to using Postman. They put in a URL for an API call that they want to make, and they hit send, and they see the results coming back here. And so we know that our Postman Echo endpoint is working. If we come down to the GraphQL endpoint, because I still have my development environment already chosen up here in the top right corner, the Spotify URL is also resolving. And if I send this over, then I should see, yep. So we got some results back from Spotify. And this is just doing a quick artist search. And if you don't like the Beach Boys, you can come into Body and you can change the name to be your favorite band. So let's do, let's see who's current in music these days. Someone in chat, give me your favorite music artist and we can make some changes in here. Otherwise, I'm just going to go with some of my standbys here. Coldplay. All right, Coldplay is a good one. So we can search for Coldplay and hit send. And so we get Coldplay back. We get an image. We get a list of their albums and so on. The nice thing about GraphQL is we can tell GraphQL which fields we want to get back. And we can see here that it actually fetched the schema from the GraphQL side of things. And that's one nice thing about Postman is if you're hitting a GraphQL endpoint, it'll do server introspection. And if you have that set up in your GraphQL API to say, these are the tables and these are the fields that are available, then you can come in here and you can actually do some auto completion. So you can say, you know, I think there was an image available. And as soon as I start typing the word, it'll say like, oh yeah, you have the image available. And under albums, for example, if I start typing some other letters, there's also an image for the album image art as well. And so it looked like there was also an ID value. So now I can send this over. And now when we get back, you know, the content, now we have the album art as well as the album ID for Coldplay albums. So this is hitting a real API. And so we're about to get started with the whole point of the mock server here is now we've hit a real API. We can do all of these endpoints. We can do a get, we can do a post, we can do put, patch, delete. And these are just changing these verbs in the interface. So you can come in here and you can duplicate these requests and set any of these headers, although these are the top 5 really that you're going to use in API development anyway. But you can come in and you can duplicate any of these if you like. And then GraphQL, it only uses post. And so, but again, you can change this and duplicate this as many times as we like. But now that we're hitting a real API, you might be wondering, well, you know, we're not actually going to be calling Postman or we're not actually going to be calling Spotify. We're actually building an API that, you know, maybe does geolocation lookups, or we're calling an API to do whatever it is your application is doing. So how do we use this information to basically carry over to what it is we're about to go build? So let's go take a look at what we can do with this from here. So we sent this over earlier, And the Postman echo is basically whatever you send it, it's just packaging up in some JSON payload and sending it straight back to you. And so if we take a look at the headers over here, we've got a param where we're setting param1 value 1, and we see these arguments basically just echoed back to us in the response. It also gives us, what our headers were, as well as the full URL. And this is just something that Postman set up as a working API that you can actually go hit and get some results. So what we're going to do here is on the right edge of the results, we see this drop down says save response. And what we're going to do is we're going to save this response as an example. So I'm going to go ahead and save that as an example, and I can call this example whatever I like. And so we'll call this like success param1. And now if I was actually building out like a geolocation API, I might say, okay, well, what was my actual API contract? Maybe I'm going to get a latitude of, 39 degrees and maybe a longitude of, 104 degrees or something like that. So you can come in here now and you can change this example to be whatever your API contract is between you and your other team. So we've hit a real API so that we can get some kind of result back. And now we can come in and we can change this saved response to be whatever we want. And the saved response is what we're going to use to build out our mock server a little bit later. So again, I had that little dot in my tab. So you got to make sure to hit save on this. You want to make sure that you're saving these changes. And then on the post, for example, going back to the GraphQL, we searched for Coldplay and we got some results back. And we're going to do the same thing here. I'm going to save that response as another example. And you're going to see in Postman, we actually see that saved response over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this success lookup just as a name. Doesn't really matter what you call it, but having helpful names here is going to show a little bit of the value in building out these mock servers. So we did a search for Coldplay. We got some Coldplay results back. Let's do another lookup here. I'm going to go to one of my favorites. I'm going to do some Bryan Adams. I'll send this over as well. So we got some Bryan Adams. I'm going to save this response as well. And what I'm going to do in this case, though, is I'm going to call this like, let's call this a 404 failure. And what we can actually do with this result is we can also change the status code that we want to come back from our mock server. In this case, I can type in 404 and say, if I search for Bryan Adams, I want to mimic a 404. And this, again, this is the value of setting up these results here. So let me go in and I'm just going to clear all of this stuff out. And I'm just going to say error. Artist not found. Now that may not be what the actual Spotify URL is going to be. It may not be the exact structure of what we would expect back from GraphQL. But again, you and your team are going to decide on what this API contract is going to look like. And so the power here within Postman is I've just made a saved example for a success. I've got a saved example for what a 404 might be. I can also come in here, for example, and I can duplicate this. And maybe I want to mimic a 500 error. Like what if the server goes down? We want to make sure that when we're building out our API that we have a good user experience. And so it might also be helpful to mimic what happens if the server's down. How can I capture that as the result so that I can do my coding to make sure I give my user a good experience? If I can't hit that third-party service, or if I'm a middleware developer, I can't hit that backend, or if I'm a backend developer, I can't hit that microservice. How do I capture that so that I can bubble up an appropriate response for my user and have a good user experience? And again, we can come in here and we can change that status code. And as soon as you start typing the numbers, we'll give you some different examples here. So maybe we'll do like a bad gateway. So we can just send back bad gateway as an example. But for the body on this one, let's set this to somebody that nobody likes to listen to. Let's do Justin Bieber. So what this is going to allow us to do for our mock server lookup, we're going to say, okay, if we search for Coldplay, we get success. If we search for Brian Adams, we're going to get a 404. And if we search for Justin Bieber, we get a 500 series error. So this is how we're going to use this in our mock data. And you can do the same thing on the RESTful APIs as well. So if I search for param1 with a value of 1, we get back a 200 status. Maybe if I search, let's duplicate this again, and we'll do like a 400 bed request. If I send over param2 with a value of 2, then I can send back a 400 bed request status, where we send back again whatever your API contract is going to look like. Bed request, try again. And you can save, like you can basically set this response to be whatever you like. So now that we have some of these saved examples, now we can tell Postman, hey, go take these saved examples and go make me a mock server. So the easiest way to do that is I'm going to click on the very top up here where we have our mock server starter kit. And I'm going to click on the 3 dots next to this, and I'm going to say mock my collection. Now the mock collection is basically going to go through all of these requests and look for any of these saved examples, and it's going to automatically spin up a mock server using those requests and the saved examples. So if we hit the mock server and we send over that exact request, then we're going to get that saved response back. And so what this is going to do is it's going to synchronize all of those saved requests. So all of our successes, our 400s and our 500s, and it's going to push all of those into our mock server. So I'm going to create a mock server over here, and I'm just going to call this KWSQA mock. And I'm just going to leave all this other stuff as our default and say, create me a mock server. Now it gives me back a URL, and I can copy this to my clipboard if I like. In this case, I clicked on it instead of the copy. So I don't want to pull this up in here. But what this will allow us to do now is we have an actual URL that I could go hit that actual URL where we had our get endpoint with param1 equals value 1. And if you spell things properly, there's our success message that we wanted to get. And so we've actually got a real server running that when I send over these exact parameters, I get that saved response back. And so now I can go do my development. I don't need that backend API to be finished. I've got a mock server now that when I send over that request, I get a saved response back. And so that's kind of the power of doing this right now, is any of these requests that we have here, sorry for toggling between light mode and dark mode if that's hard on your eyes. But now any of these saved responses are going to immediately come back from that mock server. And that mock server is running 24/7. There's nothing extra that you need to go run. You just have to know that URL to go hit. So let's go test this out inside of Postman and make sure that this actually works. Because right now, if I go back to my sample GET request and I send this over, I'm actually hitting the real Postman echo. If I come back and I hover over echo URL as my variable, I can see that from my environment, I'm still getting postman echo.com. And the same thing with our actual GraphQL lookup. This is still hitting our real Spotify URL. So if we come back over to our environments over here, we want to make a new environment for our mock server. Now, if you're in version 9 of the interface, if you're not on version 10 of Postman, create a mock server will automatically make an environment. In version 10, we don't automatically make that mock environment anymore. And so I'm going to make a new environment here, and I'm just going to call this mock. And I need to recreate those variables. So I'm going to make echo URL, and Spotify URL. But this time for my initial value, I'm actually going to paste in my mock server URL instead of the Postman Echo and the Heroku app. I'm actually going to put in my mock URL here as well. And again, I got to make sure I spell things properly or this is not going to work. And then I have to save this change as well. So I'm going to hit Command S on my Mac. And I'm going to come back to my collection. In chat, I saw a question. So it's important to know what the API contract is so we know what response to build our mock with. Yeah, and that's something that you and your team are going to try to decide on, hopefully pretty early on in the development of things, of if I call this request and I have this endpoint and I have these parameters, then I want to get back a response that looks approximately like this. Now, it might only be 90% finished. You want to allow for a little bit of flexibility if something actually needs to change. But if you have what that API contract is going to look like, then you can come in here and you can alter these saved responses to be approximately what you want your API contract to be between you and your team. And so this also forces good communication with your team of, hey, while you go build that API, I actually want to go build a mock server out of this so that you don't have to like rush and like, you know, hurry things and maybe mistakes are made. They can go do their API development properly using good testing practices and everything, hopefully. But in the meantime, you've got a mock server that you can go build, and you can start building your code against a mock server for approximately what you think your API contract is going to be. So yeah, thanks for asking, Anthony. It's a good question. So let's go test this out. Let's make sure that this actually works. So now that I made my mock environment, I'm going to come back up to the top right corner of the Postman app, and I'm going to choose my mock environment instead of my development environment. Now, if I hover over echo URL, I can see that the URL actually changed to be my mock server instead of the Postman echo. And so if I come back to my GET request and I send this over, where before we saw the result coming back as our Postman echo result, now, because I've set my mock environment, when I send this over, I actually get my saved response back. And again, remember, we had a param2 and a value2, that if I come into my URL up here on my address bar within Postman, not the address bar of your browser, but within Postman, if I change this to param2 value2 and I send that over, now I get my mocked 400 bad request back as well. And so our mock server is looking at the verb, and it's looking at the URL that you're sending over and says, whatever this is, I want you to go look up on the Postman side, and whatever response you have to send me back that's appropriate for the verb and the URL that I've sent, give me back, you know, the closest match that you have to the response. So because we had a saved response here that when we called param2 value2, we got back this 400 bad request with this error message. When I actually call this from our mock environment with param2 value2, when we send that over, we actually get our 400 bad request. Now, the nice thing with Postman is this is really, really fast to update as well. So if I come in here, if I search for param3 value3, again, we could also mock out, you know, what happens if we get a 500. So let's do a 500 internal server error. As soon as I hit save on this and I come back up to my GET request and I change this to mock3 value3 and send this over, I immediately get back that internal server error. So when we make a change here, let me go change the name of this, it immediately updates the mock server on the Postman cloud. And so it's an immediate synchronization of this. So we'll call this just 500 error. So any changes that you make inside of Postman with these saved examples, it's immediately going to synchronize that over to Postman. And the next time you call that mock server, it's going to give you back that new response. And so you can do that for any of these verbs. And for GraphQL, you can do this as many times as we want over here. Now, there is something a little bit different that we need to do when we're sending information, because as I mentioned, the mock server on Postman is looking at the verb and it's looking at the URL of what we're sending over. Now, in this case, we had parameters that we're actually sending as part of that URL. And so for a GET request, it was really easy for our mock server to take a look at that and go, oh, for these exact parameters, I have these exact, you know, this exact response to send back. But when you're doing a post or you're doing a put or a patch or sometimes even a delete, you might be sending data in the body as well. And with GraphQL, we're absolutely sending things in the body. We have the whole query structure. We've also got our GraphQL data that sends in the body, where typically the mock server is only looking at the verb, and it's only looking at the address of the URL that we're sending. And so if I try to send this over right now and I search for Brian Adams, I got a 404. Oh, actually. Oh, did they change something on the mock server? There used to be an extra field that we had to send over for actually testing this with the mock server. They might have changed this automatically for us. Let's go back and let's check for Justin Bieber. And send that over. So notice when we search for Justin Bieber, we also got a 404. Justin Bieber should have given us a 500 error. So what we need to tell GraphQL when we're actually calling this on the mock server is we need to tell this, hey, I actually need to, we actually need to match the body of what we're sending over as well. Because again, we typically only match on the verb and the address. And so there's a little bit of extra work that we need to do, and this will apply for GraphQL because it's using POST, but also any of our RESTful APIs where you're sending data in the body. So for the post and the put and the patch, there's an extra header that we need to send on the request to say, I also want to match the body. And so what we're going to do is we're going to click on headers. And again, this is on the request itself, not on the response, but on the request itself. We're going to go into our headers and we're going to add a new header. And this is only used for the mock server. And so if you're developing against your mock server, you're also going to need to send this header. But in a real production system, you won't need to send this header because you'll actually be hitting a real server. But for Postman, we're going to do xmock. And what we want to do here is we want to set this one that says xmock match request body. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but we want to set that as our key and we want to set our value to true. What this is going to do is it's going to say, hey, when I send over this request to the mock server, I don't want to just match the header or the verb and the URL. I also want to match on the request body. If you notice with the auto completion, there's also another one where you say, I also want to match any headers as well. That will also allow you some extra flexibility as well. But for today, we're just going to do the xmock match request body, and we're going to set this to true. So again, that's on the request itself, not on the saved responses. If I send this over now, notice it came back and said like, I didn't find anything that matched. This is an error that came back from the mock server. So it's basically saying like, you wanted me to check all this stuff. I don't know what it is you want me to send back. And so it's giving us an error. So one more thing that we need to change is on each of these saved responses, and you'll need to do this on any saved responses you do for your RESTful API as well, is we want to add a header coming back that says, I want to set the content type of this to be application JSON. Because we're getting back a JSON payload of data. And then again, you want to make sure that you save this change. And we need to do that for each of our saved responses. So I need to go in here and set our content type. JSON, save that one. We'll do the same for our 500. Okay, so now that we've got those saved as our saved responses here, I'm just going to close up some of these tabs up here. Let's go actually make these calls again. So if we come back and we look at the body, so again, we added the header on the request only for the xmock match request body. We set it to a true value. If I come back over to my body and we search for Justin Bieber, now we should get back our 500 error. And we did, we got our 502 bad gateway. And if I search for, was it Bryan Adams? And I send this over, we get our 400 series error. Now, actually, in this case, we got an error from the mock server saying that that didn't match. So we'll come back and we'll look at that in a moment. And then for our success, we were looking for Coldplay. So let's make sure that one still works. So Coldplay worked. So Coldplay, we got our 200 series response or status code, but our Bryan Adams one didn't work. So why didn't Bryan Adams work? Oh, that's because I set this not as a header. I'm sending this over as a parameter. So I made a mistake here. We don't want to set this as a param. We want to make sure that we're sending these things as headers for that content type. On the Bryan Adams one, I think I accidentally set it as a param and not a header. So let's come in here and we'll set that header to be content type application JSON. I'm going to save that. That automatically syncs it on the Postman cloud. Now, if I come back in here and I search for Bryan Adams, now we get our custom 404 artist not found error. So again, that header is just on the response where we're setting the content type, and the header on the outgoing request, we need to set that header for the X mock match request body. And again, this is Postman specific only. So if you're developing against the Postman mock server, you set this header, set it to a true value, and now you can build as many of these responses as you like. Now, if you were actually building an application against Spotify, this would be pretty helpful, where you come in and say, if I search for Coldplay, I know that's going to work. If I search for Bryan Adams, I know I'm going to get a 400 error. If I search for Justin Bieber, I know I'm going to get a 500 error. And again, this will allow you to develop your own code for productivity purposes, where what if the server's down? What if the user does something weird? How can I capture that response so that I can give them a good user experience and build against that? And so the power of this mock server now is we can come in here and we can build out as many of these things as we like. Now, when it comes to RESTful APIs, of course, we wouldn't be calling /get. The /get path is specific to our Postman echo, but this might actually be something like go get all of our books from our library, or maybe I want to go get a specific book of, books 15. That would be more of a RESTful endpoint. And so again, you can set that path to whatever you like, but you're going to need to make sure that you set that path in the saved response, because the mock server is looking at these saved responses for when I call this URL. If I call /books with param1 value 1, then maybe I get back, latitude. Well, in this case, we wouldn't make sense to get latitude and longitude back for a book, but you can set that payload to be whatever your API contract specifies. But you'll want to make sure that your path in here is also set properly. So we set it to /get because that's what the Postman echo was looking for. For GraphQL, your path is pretty much always going to be /GraphQL, unless you're doing something specific where you're specifically changing that path to be something else. You're probably always going to be hitting /GraphQL as your endpoint. But for a RESTful endpoint, your post endpoint isn't going to go to /post. It's going to go to /users, or it's going to go to /books, or it's going to go to /locations, or something like it'll actually be your actual RESTful path. So make sure that when you're calling the Postman echo, that you're actually setting the path to be /post or /put. Those paths are required for our Postman echo to work. But when you're saving the request here, or when you're saving that response, make sure that you set your path to what you want your path to actually be, so that when you're actually building out your real API and you're developing against what you want your real API to be, that these paths match what you're going to be developing against, so that when we call our mock server with /books with param1 value 1, that we're actually getting back what we're looking for. These might be search terms, or go look for like a partial author match or something like that, and make sure that I get back this saved response. Because again, the mock server is going to look for this exact path. as well as any parameters that you're sending over. So that's Mux servers in a nutshell. So from a productivity point of view, you can come in here and you can call our Postman echo URL. And if you're building against GraphQL, for example, excuse me, you can use our Spotify API if you like. Again, it's a working server that you can actually go hit to get some kind of response. We're going to come in here, we're going to save those responses, and all of those saved responses, then we go build a mock server out of that. And that mock server is running all the time. Now that mock server, I think by default on the free plan, I think it allows up to 1,000 calls a day, which for a developer is quite a lot. Now, if you're building automated testing, you probably don't want to do automated testing against the mock server because you might exhaust the API usage against the mock server, but it will allow for up to 1,000 calls per day, I believe. And so it's going to give you a lot of flexibility as a developer now to say, hey, I actually want to go build, I want to go build my front end, or I want to go build my middleware, but I can't wait for that API to actually be finished. You can come in here and you can spin up a mock server, and now you've got something that you can actually call for real. I've actually got a real URL that I can go call, and we actually saw that in the browser. And when we came in and we searched for param1 value 1, we got this thing back. If I search for param2, oops, and value 2, because this is a GET request, I can call this directly in my browser. I get that bad request. And if I search for param3 value 3, then we get back our 500 server error. And so this URL is live 24/7 that you can go hit and get these saved responses back. Cool, we got a couple of minutes left. I don't want to run too close to the end of everybody's lunch. But if you've got questions, I'm happy to open it up for Q&A. I've got plenty of time. I'm happy to hang out on the call.
Thank you. Anyone have anything they'd like to ask? You touched on it kind of just at the end there, but I was thinking that in addition to sort of unblocking front-end development potentially while waiting for the API to be built out, I wonder, would something like this also be helpful to help you sort of like simulate situations that are maybe not always easy to get into, like some of those error conditions and stuff? Maybe like this is an ongoing testing tool, like even after your API really works and everything, but you just need to sort of test out these edge cases that are, can be tricky to get into in sort of an end-to-end sense.
Yeah, especially because like when you're calling a real API, if you're calling like a Google API, for example, for geolocation, you're probably not going to get a 500 error. Like that thing's going to be online all the time. But
yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
The off chance that it does happen to fail, how do you capture that as a response so that you can handle that gracefully for your user? And that's where the power of the mock server comes in, is you can absolutely go in and mock out any of those status codes, any kind of response that you want to get back. You can build out as many of those saved examples as you like, and the mock server is just going to feed that back. As soon as it matches that exact parameter, you're going to get back that saved response. And so it's a really, really helpful tool for building against those kinds of things and testing, where I'm not actually using up my real Google API calls where, you pay money for that kind of stuff. You can look at their API contract and you can kind of build out what you expect to happen. You can test and build against a mock server, and then you can actually go hit the real server and make sure it's actually working properly. Or you can, of course, use Postman for actually calling their API and saving those responses if you want something a little more exact. But it will help you save money. Honestly, all this is available on the free plan on Postman. It doesn't cost anything to spin up a mock server. You don't have to be on a paid plan for any of this. And so it's a really useful tool to come in, like you say, to kind of get into all those little corner cases and edge cases that might actually be really tricky to replicate in the real world, but it could happen. What if somebody's internet connection drops, mid request? How does your server respond to that? If you're building out a mobile application, how's the mobile app going to respond if it can't hit that backend API? Now you can start building the code for what if I can't get there at all? what do I do? How do we capture that gracefully so that we can give our user a good experience?
For sure. Yeah, I just know I've been in those situations in the past where it's like, well, this could happen and we should probably like test that the right outcome happens, you know, in that rare case, but how do I actually, and then doing just like really either terrible, hacky, labor intensive things to try and simulate that. But this seems really, really easy. So yeah, lots of good comments in the chat. People saying they're probably going to go back and watch the recording, that this looks easy and much better than expensive commercial tools. So
yeah,
it's
and
like,
as Nicholas said in chat, you know, the automatic deployment of updates to the mock servers is really, really awesome. Like as soon as you hit save in Postman, it's going to synchronize that over to the Postman server, and that new saved response is ready to go. And so you can go in and you can duplicate as many of those as you like for any edge case that you like.
great. Yeah, I personally did not know about any of this until reading the description of your talk. So yeah, really great thing to be aware of, I think. Good tool.
Yep. Postman does a lot of things. I mean, a lot of people use it just, hey, I want to go hit that API for real and see the response and like, you know, develop against that. But there's a lot more inside of Postman. We have teams that are actually using it to develop their APIs, where you can go in and you can build out all kinds of really advanced testing, like contract testing and so on. So yeah, I look forward to doing more talks in the future. Maybe I'll do one on contract testing, like how do we make sure our API contract is actually doing what we expect it to do, or how do we actually build an API using Postman? I'd be happy to cover any of those talks in the future. I've got my LinkedIn and my Twitter on here. I use the same username on both of those platforms. Absolutely happy to take questions anytime. Reach out to me, please. Yeah, I hope to get up there in the future. Maybe I'll try to come up in for the conference in September.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Back up north and see everybody.
Sounds like we've got some votes for a talk on contract testing. And yeah, anyway, we'll talk more in the future. But in the meantime, thank you everyone for coming out today, and hope to see you again in 2023 when this series resumes. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of 2022 and the holiday season, whatever you do to celebrate. And thanks again, Ian. It's been great to meet you and hear from you on this topic. So everybody enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Cheers, everyone. See you next time.
Thanks.